Hey, do you know about the USA? Do you know about the government?
We're not going to do that to you.
Is copyrighted?
I don't know who's going to sue me. Hey guys, welcome to hashtag Odd Couple. Tom Ritchie and myself, HipHughes, and we're going to invite Paul Sargent in a little while, and we're going to give you a massive, at least for most of us, a 2-hour review session. At least Mr. Ritchie is going to stay for a little bit shorter than that, but he's going to be a valuable resource tonight for you. So we know that you're a little stressed out. The exam is tomorrow. With 60 questions, 45 minutes, 100 minutes, 4 essays you have to do. It's going to be okay. So before we get started, just a couple things. You can tweet us. We're using the hashtag Odd Couple, but tag us. When we're not delivering instruction, we can go through some questions, and we can't get to everybody, but if you're following us, we see you. We'll try to get to you. Like Megan Bagwell, who's already doing the right thing. Her teacher, Coach Ramsey, they're watching, they're ready to go. So really quick, I'm just going to show you, because if you're hearing something and you're like, I already know that, myself and Tom and Mr. Sargent have resources where you can pause the video, go on the web, watch a video, come back, and kind of create your own study session in a second, in a sense. So really quick, I'm just going to switch the screen really quick. There we go. Here we go. So this is my website. You can go to hiphughes.com. And the stream is there as well. But right up on top, there's the video arsenal. And they're organized so nicely. And I'm not an organized guy. But you can see, obviously, we have politics. And if you click that on, you're going to, hopefully see some videos where you go, oh, my gosh, iron triangles are going to kill me. And you can go watch that video, as well as every part of the Constitution, plenty in there. And also we have for you some current events. So if you're looking for some things to write about, they might be a little old. I've been out of the classroom a little while, but that should help you as well. So we're trying to give you, the best instruction possible for you, but that means you have to be kind of an active participant in this as well. So we're going to switch back now, and I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Ritchie so he can introduce himself and guide you some resources that might help as well. And then we'll get started. How about that? Giddy up for the learning. Mr. Ritchie.
All right, ladies and gentlemen. Well, Keith, thank you very much for having us. For having me. I'm not speaking the royal we or anything like that, right? So as far as that goes, very glad to be here tonight. And if I may, let me tell you about, Keith's got a lot of great stuff on his website. I've got a little review app for you. It's called Romulus. It's available at the App Store and on Google Play. Big man Tyrone endorses it. We've got U.S. history, Euro, Gov, and world history. So far, we're in 4 subjects, and the AP government app is only $3.99. Mr. Betts' class likes it. Can't be that bad. And so you can go to the App Store or Google Play and purchase Romulus Government. Now, one thing that I want to note here right now, number 4 in education, it's having a pretty good night. It's $2.99. I think, of course, that's coming from me. I think it's the best $2.99 you're going to spend on this thing, because it's got sections that are, for, like, if you're like, hey, I want to quiz myself on Congress. I want to quiz myself on the presidency. I want to quiz myself on court cases. We've got one section that is exclusively dedicated to court cases. So for just $2.99, you've got, over 300 questions that are going to help you cram and just quiz yourself. Quizzing yourself is a great way to get yourself ready. So with that, I hope that y'all will buy my app. But whether you buy my app or not, we're going to get some stuff out here and start answering some questions. And so, Gray Ramsey, thank you so much for the kind words. And as far as that sort of thing here, Morgan, let's make sure Morgan, who's following me on Twitter, thank you so much, at Tom Ritchie on Twitter and Instagram. I might do some Instagram shout outs in a little bit. So what is the main role of federal bureaucrats in the government? Now, federal bureaucrats, these are people who are career employees in the executive branch of government. So, and typically the people who are kind of the middle management, the paper pushers, and there are different theories of government. Now, Keith has a lot of great videos on elite theory, pluralism, hyperpluralism, bureaucratic theory of government. There are some people that say really that it's not necessarily the legislature that, decides how the government's run. It's really the bureaucrats in the executive branch, because they have bureaucratic discretion. Sometimes, when, it's just kind of like when the policeman pulls you over and decides, well, they've got that decision. They can hit you with a ticket for the full amount. They can let you off with a warning, or they can say, you know what, you were going 25 miles over. I just did it for 10 miles over. Here you go. So the bureaucrats a lot of times are the people who are actually making the policies. Now, also, you sometimes have some of these executive, regulatory agencies like the FEC. The FEC gets to, the FEC, the FCC. These agencies have some discretion about how they do things. So the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, a few months ago, they were in the news with this whole net neutrality thing. So they keep going back and forth on that. And that's not congressional legislation. That these regulatory agencies typically have powers that are delegated to them by Congress. Daniel is asking here. Daniel, following me on Twitter. Nice of you. Daniel's asking, what differences are there between fiscal and monetary policy? Now, fiscal policy is when this is taxes and spending, okay? Fiscal policy is set by Congress. So anytime you see government spending or taxation, so the tax bill that just passed a couple months ago, that was fiscal policy, all right? And when government decides what to spend, fiscal policy. Monetary policy is set by the Federal Reserve. And that's when the Federal Reserve sets interest rates, they raise the rates, lower the rates, the discount rates, and also when the Federal Reserve expands or contracts the money supply. So that is the difference between fiscal policy and monetary policy. Murray, all right, Murray, a good friend of mine, longtime supporter. I think, Murray, you've gone through like APUSH and or Euro already. Thank you so much for supporting my work. So not just, this is somebody I followed back because she's been so good to me. And so as far as that goes, Murray, you've asked about the important court cases that you need to know. There are 8 court cases that I typically refer to as Tier 1 court cases, okay? Now, these are, I would say, first of all, your Marshall court cases. Marbury v. Madison, McCulloch versus Maryland, and Gibbons versus Ogden. And remember, not just the specific cases, but also remember, Marbury v. Madison, of course, judicial review, but remember that the Marshall court tended to rule in favor of a stronger federal government, in favor of business enterprise. Keith showing off those guns there. And against the states, like McCulloch versus Maryland, the state of Maryland wanted to tax the Bank of the United States, even though the bank is never in the Constitution. McCulloch versus Maryland, Marshall Court rules that the bank is a legitimate function of the federal government. Now, remember, a loose constructionist, they see government power as the delegated powers. Now, the delegated powers are the powers that are given to the federal government by the states, and a strict constructionist, they think only the enumerated powers. Okay, Keith, let me turn this over to Keith. He's got some things he's doing with his hands. I think he's got something for us. So, Keith, go into these different types of powers.
Yeah, and I want to talk about. I want to hit Selective Incorporation really quick too, because Average Looking, that's your name, asked about Get Low, and it reminds me of Selective Incorporation. And I just want to give a shout out to Martrone's class. Look at that. They're all watching. It's like an AP government party. How about that? And Aaron Foster asked about how Congress and the president can influence the court. But, Tom mentioned those 3 important court cases. And I like to use my hands and my body a lot to help kids remember. So I don't really have guns, kids. It's a joke. But I always think of the Marshall Plan. I call him John Schwarzenegger Marshall, because it reminds me of that concept that those are your strength cases. Tom mentioned, Marbury versus Madison. And if you don't know Marbury versus Madison, you shouldn't show up tomorrow. Like, don't go. You're going to fail. I kid you, but you should really know it. But McCulloch versus Maryland, Gibbons versus Ogden, I always do that guns idea, because that's the answer. You're going to find it. They strengthen the national government. And we'll come back to court cases, because I'm going to hit Selective Incorporation. But I always do this, right? You have those loose constructionists, right, who are reading into the Constitution, whether that might be like a Mapp versus Ohio court case where, you're getting the right of privacy and, that sort of thing out of that, or Roe versus Wade with abortion. It's not in the Constitution, but they're reading loosely and they're kind of adopting to times. That's kind of an activist approach. So, the liberal approach, we stretch the Constitution as opposed to a narrow reading where they're not gonna find things that aren't in the Constitution. So that would be like the Rehnquist court or a conservative court. But selective incorporation, that's a really good bet for a free response. Like, I would definitely prepare to write about that. And the idea behind selective incorporation is you have to remember the Bill of Rights is in the federal Constitution. It applies to federal laws, federal action. It wasn't written for the states. The states, they got their own constitutions, right? But with the 14th Amendment, if you're going to memorize any amendment, 10 and 14 are really smart to memorize because 10 is kind of the reserve power and federalism concept. And the 14th Amendment really is going to give way to this concept. I'm going to say it 3 times. Selective incorporation, selective incorporation, selective incorporation. Because what that is permission for applying some of those Bill of Rights to the states. So I'm going to give you a couple court cases. These are really important, actually. So the 14th Amendment, of course, was born out of the Civil War. And if you look at the words, no state, Alabama, shall deny its citizens. Those new slaves that are citizens, right? Due process, rights under the law. No state shall deny its citizens equal protection and due process. That was written primarily, right, to deal with these freedmen who were becoming new citizens, and we wanted to protect them, in the future. That's why it's no state. It changes the context of federalism, right? It's in a sense saying, the states have to follow this rule in the Constitution. So right away, you had, I believe it was in Baltimore. I'm looking for Tom to nod his head. It's Baltimore, the slaughterhouse cases, where you have these, guys who have a slaughterhouse. It's, I think, near like the river in Baltimore. And basically the state, Maryland and Baltimore, the city, are going to kind of take that over to do, kind of business for the city, public kind of things. And the slaughterhouse people are like, wait a minute, no state, Maryland, shall deny its citizens.
Louisiana.
People. What's that?
Louisiana.
Is it from Louisiana? Yeah, Baltimore would make no sense. I knew it was near water. There you go, New Orleans, Louisiana. But the concept—
Baltimore's near water. You ever seen The Wire?
I said it was like water, but Louisiana as well. I've been to Louisiana, more water near Louisiana. But the concept is that they're trying to use that 14th Amendment to, kind of protect their business private interest. And the court laughs at them. The court's like, no, it's for the freedmen, you jokers, you ding-dongs, get out of town. Then we see Plessy versus Ferguson, where, Plessy is like, okay, I'm here for the 14th Amendment, and they deny him that right. But as we go into the 20th century, we're going to start using that 14th Amendment. I used to do it like a crane game. Like the crane would be the federal government using the 14th Amendment to go and pick pieces of the Bill of Rights out to apply to the states. So I believe it was Average Looking. You should change your name, man, really. Is going to ask about Gitlow versus New York. Now, you can look up the facts of the case. It's a socialist. He's handing out manifestos. New York is like, dude, that's violent stuff. You can't do that. And he goes to the Supreme Court pointing to the First Amendment, sure, but also the 14th Amendment, that crane. Will the Supreme Court in Gitlow in the early 20th century take that First Amendment, which is meant for the federal government, and change federalism by applying it to the state of New York and hence all the other states? And the answer is yes. And from there on, we're going to get all those other expansive cases, whether it's, Mapp versus Ohio, or it's going to be, Miranda versus Arizona, where we're going to selectively incorporate parts of the Bill of Rights to the states. They have not all been selectively incorporated, but please know that word because it's muy importante. I'm sure Tom has some questions that he's ready to hit out of the park. He's eating. What are you eating?
Yeah, this is actually my second of 3 broadcasts tonight. So,
yeah.
So ladies and gentlemen, now I was talking about the powers of government and federalism. Now, remember, again, Marbury versus Madison, Keith said you shouldn't show up tomorrow if you don't know what that is. If you don't know what federalism is, don't show up tomorrow, okay? Now, federalism is where we divide powers between a central government and state governments, okay? So that is federalism. Now, remember, under the Articles of Confederation, now the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution, both created a federal system, but the articles really went on strong states, where the Constitution, as it was originally written, sought a balance between the federal government and the state governments, where with the 14th Amendment and other amendments subsequently, we've seen, more of an erosion of federalism, especially with the progressive amendments. You think about like the 17th Amendment, the direct election of senators, the income tax, stuff like that. Now, federalism, though, it describes this power sharing between the federal government and state governments. Now, the federal government has the delegated powers. Now, these are enumerated powers. These are the powers that are listed, and then implied powers, okay? Implied powers are the powers that may not be listed, but they're still intended for the government to have. That is what we call the necessary and proper clause, or the elastic clause, because it says that Congress has these powers in Article 1, Section 8. And then they also have the powers that are necessary and proper. What I always talk about in class, in the sense that if I ask a student to open the door, I'm implying that the student should also get out of their seat to open the door, because technically they might be able to, scoot at the door. But then again, now reserved powers, ladies and gentlemen, reserved powers are the powers that are reserved to the states. Now, Keith talked about the 10th Amendment. Powers not delegated are reserved to the states and to the people. Now, and then you've got concurrent powers that are exercised by both. I tell you what, remember, kids, stay hydrated. Kenzie, so good to see you. Somebody else who's been supporting my work over the years, and thank you so much. Now, Federalist 10 and Federalist 51 are both very important. Now, Federalist 10, what you want to note, there are 2 points that Madison's making here. Now, remember that the Federalists are arguing that the Constitution is both federal and Republican in character, whereas, the Anti-Federalists are arguing that this Constitution is going to create a national government that is not going to be a republic, okay? And so as far as that goes, that Federalist 10, one of the things that the Anti-Federalists said, that when the Roman Republic was small, then the Roman Republic worked as a republic. It was when the Roman Republic became a large republic that it ceased to be a republic and it turned into a military dictatorship and empire. And so Madison's saying, well, you know what? Actually, a large republic is a good thing. So remember, your first understanding of Federalist 10 is a large republic is a good thing for republicanism. Because, now why is that? Because it controls factions. Okay, write that down, factions. So when it comes down to it, Madison in Virginia, and if you think about it today, like good luck running for governor in South Carolina as a Democrat, or good luck running for governor in California as a Republican. Now, if you're running for president, you can run as a Democrat or a Republican. What we see in the several states is in most states, one party is clearly dominant. And Madison argues that the larger the republic, the harder it is for one faction, for a single faction to be able to take control. And that's why it's cool for republicanism to have a large republic. And so then Federalist 51. So Federalist 10, large republics are good because they help control faction. And so Federalist 51, Madison is writing about the separation of powers and federalism. So the thing is, the Anti-Federalists are afraid that the government is this government created by the Constitution, because it has more power, is going to be a tyranny. Madison says, well, no, because this government has more power, but we also have included checks and balances. And so you have the legislative, executive, judicial. Remember, that comes from Montesquieu, the Enlightenment philosopher, the spirit of the laws. And you have 3 branches of government that all have the power to check each other, that all of these branches are jealous of their power. So, of course, the president wants to have power, but the president is not going to be able to do anything that he wants. Now, also, you've got the checks and balances from federalism. So Madison is making the point here that the states also retain a lot of power under the Constitution. Thank you very much, Kenzie. And I think Keith's been writing down some stuff. Let's see what he's been writing down over there.
I've just been journaling my feelings for the day. So let's go through a few things really quick. And everybody who's waiting for like fiscal federalism and like the 527s and the PACs and the super PACs, like Mr. Sargent is coming and he's like the master of that stuff. So that stuff is locked and loaded. It's ready to go. I want to talk a little bit more about court stuff, but not too much. But someone changed their name to HipHughes roasted me. That's cray. So I'm going to try to at least address the question. I have a video on iron triangles, but really quickly, just so you get the major idea down, and I would watch that video and dig a little bit deeper. But, you know, an iron triangle is kind of the concept that public policy is kind of locked in with these three entities, that you have Congress and specifically committees and subcommittees that deal with, let's say, fiscal issues, like a subcommittee on the Treasury or banking or something like that. Those Congress people, they have to raise money to run, right? So where do they get their money from? They get it from that other point on the triangle, which is those special interest groups. So let's like keep fiscal stuff going, right? Who's going to be in favor of, say, like that tax cut? Right? It's going to be, you know, maybe banks or Wall Street or, large economic groups. So they're going to fund money to Congress people, right, to support that endeavor. And then you have the bureaucracy, right? So once you pass that law or you're trying to do something, you have like the FEC and the SEC and the economic regulators who are then, going to keep regulation low. They're going to do things to help that other part of that special interest group. So it's kind of hard if you have a new idea, if Congress is locked and loaded with that money flowing and the regulations which are helping that money flow, and Congress is rubbing their back and they're rubbing their back and the iron triangle is flowing. It's hard to get in there and to change public policy. That's the basic concept. But you want to look, you have liberal laws, conservative laws that all can be found to fall into that iron triangle. But you need a bureaucracy. So you need some kind of agency. So that might be like the Security and Exchange Commission. It might be the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. And then you need that committee and subcommittee, that Congress piece. And then you need that interest group, whether it's an interest group like an oil company that wants to gut EPA, or it's an interest group like the Sierra Club that wants to strengthen the EPA. But that's the concept behind iron triangles. Now, somebody asked about single member districts. And I want to talk really quick so you understand, like basically how Congress gets elected, not the senators, right? We all know the 17th Amendment is going to kind of make that popular vote within the state. So if you're running, for senator of South Carolina or West Virginia, you don't have a district. It's the whole state which is going to elect you. But gerrymandering is when you have that state legislature who's in charge of drawing congressional lines. So let's say, and we're not talking about small states like Wyoming. I think Wyoming's got one congressperson, right? South Dakota, one. North Dakota, one, because they don't have enough people for two districts. But once you get into like New York or California or Florida or these bigger states, there might be, 30 districts. So that means that state legislature is going to draw those lines to make up those 30 districts. And gerrymandering is the idea that whatever political party is in charge of drawing those lines, they're going to draw those lines so it's favorable to themselves. Right? It's going to be favorable to themselves. And what happens because of that is if I, take, let's say, the very conservative demographics of my state, and I know they're all located kind of in this pocket and maybe this pocket, I'm going to draw a funny line to trap them. So they can have their conservative district, but then I'm going to have 3 liberal districts. And many times when those districts get deep, deep blue or deep, deep red, you get kind of these single member districts. Sometimes people don't even run against them because there's no point. And you can decide if that's good or bad, but a lot of people think that's not good for democracy and the republic, because the idea is you should be compromising. There should be competition, pluralism. We didn't talk too much about kind of ideology in democracies, but this idea of pluralism, that everybody has a voice, that we all contribute, that out of many voices, we figure out public policy. Gerrymandering might make that difficult to occur. And we're not going to go over all the theories, but elite theory and pluralism and hyper pluralistic theory. There's a lot of theories. So really quick, and I'm going to turn it back to Tom because he's not going to be here too long. Somebody asked, and I never answered it, about the idea of how Congress and the president can influence the Supreme Court. So really quick, things you have to know about the Supreme Court, right? You have to know the rule of 4, that it takes 4 members to take a case. You have to know that they have lifetime terms. right? They're supposed to be immune to public policy. In a sense, they are the referees, right? Marbury versus Madison made them the black and white stripes. So if the referee is being influenced by the cheering or the booing crowd, you don't want that. You want the referee to follow the rules. But let's say the president or Congress really doesn't like these decisions that are coming out. How could they change the Supreme Court? Well, I mean, you could impeach a court member, but they'd have to murder somebody or something. So the only way you can do it is either wait for them to retire and nominate someone new. Technically, Congress could write a law to expand the number of justices. Remember court packing from U.S. history. FDR tried that business and people were like, that ain't cool. But really, the only way to do it is to amend the Constitution, to change the rule book. You change the rule book, you change the decisions. And I always used to do this with my kids. It might help or it might not. There's a couple ways to change the Constitution, but the way that it's been used, I think everything maybe except the 19th Amendment is ba-bumpa, 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 ba-bumpa. 2/3 of both houses. That means 2/3 of the Senate, 2/3 of the House of Representatives, and then 3/4 of all the states. If you want to write about federalism, you can just write about the process of amending the Constitution, because it's not the states that can amend it kind of alone in that scenario, but you need the federal government too. So make sure that you understand there is a way to change court decisions, but it's a drastic way and it doesn't happen that often. Amend the Constitution. And remember, lifetime appointments, so they are immune to public opinion. They're following the rules. They shouldn't be influenced with what's cool or what's not cool or what's hip or what's popular. That's really, really important to know. The Supreme Court, in a sense, are those referees that are supposed to, be blind to public opinion. So that's a lot of information. What do you think, Tom? You probably got something to say.
All right. And Keith, and I think we want to remember the technical term for that is an independent judiciary. Okay. That's something that will show up on the exam where it's like, when you talk about them being appointed versus elected and having those serving on good behavior, so to speak, an independent judiciary. All right. So let me go ahead and shout out to WCHS, Amanda Fox. You enjoy memes. I tell you what, I enjoy memes as well, Amanda. If you can send me some memes, I think that would be great. That would make my night. Now, as far as that goes, ladies and gentlemen, you've got linkage institutions. All right. So I've actually got a video on this. So you can get a full explanation. Just type in linkage institutions. You'll see my video. These are institutions that keep us in touch with our government. So really, in the course of my day, what you got to think about is I wouldn't know what's going on in the government if it weren't for political parties, interest groups, and the media. Okay. So the thing is, political parties, like I can get involved with my local party. I get emails from my county party and they say, we're having a meeting here. We're having a meeting there. Call your legislator and tell them about this. And so that keeps me apprised of what's going on. Sometimes they'll say Congressman Duncan is coming to talk at the next meeting. And so, that's the political party is a linkage institution. The other thing is, if I wanted to run for office, I would go and I would have a conversation with my county party chair. Like typically that's what I was reading an interview with Senator Tim Scott, and, he didn't know when he ran for, county council or whatever he ran for the first time. He went and talked to the Democratic and the Republican Party chair. He wasn't sure which one he wanted to run as. And so they help to find candidates for office. So if you decide I want to be more involved, there you go. Interest groups, okay, which I'm a teacher. I get emails from the Teachers Association, and they say this is what's going on in the legislature and all that. If you're a member of the NRA, you would get a magazine telling you this is what's going on. They give you report cards, who to vote for. So, they get money and employ lobbyists so that, people who support the interest group can lobby the government. And so linkage institutions, they're providing these links here. Now, then there's the media, and the media is where we get information. Okay. We get information about basically what's going on. So of course, lately it seems like a lot of that information is about Stormy Daniels and stuff like that. A lot of times the media is telling us what we want to hear, not necessarily what we need to hear. But the thing is that through the media, and we have a lot of different sources of media nowadays, we find out what's going on. So political parties, interest groups in the media. Now, elections are also described as a linkage institution. And of course, without political parties, interest groups, or the media, we wouldn't know who to vote for, who to support. Those are the three means by which we find out who we're going to vote for. All right. So as far as that is concerned, oh, I tell you what, is CJ Pearson taking APGOV? Oh my goodness. Okay. Yes. If CJ Pearson is watching, shout out to this guy. So I tell you what, this guy's like verified, taking AP government, already verified. I tell you what, the CJ Pearson, I tell you. All right. So he's taken, he's got a logo. that is legit. 124,000 followers there. Wow. Okay. So as far as that, oh my goodness, CJ Pearson just retweeted a Kanye meme. Oh my, you know what? That is that's quite a point there, CJ Pearson. All right. So anyway, let's see if I can grab one more question before we introduce our friend Paul Sargent. Now, one thing I would say, Amaya, is I would pay special attention to some of the civil rights acts, like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Civil Rights Act of 1968. Now, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was about public facilities and employment. Okay, so basically it made it illegal in 64 to segregate schools and public venues, and also made it illegal to hire people based on race. Okay, so you couldn't you have to be, when you see an equal opportunity employer, that's the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was designed to try to give the federal government a way to intervene when states were stopping minorities from voting. And so there were several states and localities, most of these states in the Deep South, but a few exceptions, most of these states in the Deep South that were, okay. As far as that goes, the Deep South that were singled out here, and what happened is they had to get pre-clearance before they could, change their voting laws. Now, the Supreme Court recently, in a 2013 decision, the Supreme Court basically gutted the Voting Rights Act. They didn't say that the Voting Rights Act was unconstitutional, but what the majority did say was the criteria hadn't been updated in 48 years. So you can't continue to put restrictions on South Carolina and Louisiana and Alabama when you haven't revised your, you don't, because of stuff they were doing in the 1960s. Okay, 50 years later, that's not going to fly. So the Voting Rights Act, the Supreme Court ruled, could be reapplied, but there would have to be evidence of continued, you'd have to do a full survey again and see where are we finding discrimination. Now, finally, the Civil Rights Act of 1968 was the Voting Rights Act. Okay, I'm sorry, that was 65. Sorry, it's been a long week. I got APUSH as well. So that is the Fair Housing Act. Okay, the Fair Housing Act. So as far as that goes, ladies and gentlemen, again, if any of you have joined us, Romulus has a great AP Government Review app. If you just type in AP Government Review at the App Store, and it's got a section on court cases, I think that's worth the $2.99 just right there. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce my friend Paul Sargent. And Paul Sargent's been teaching AP Government for over a decade. Some of y'all might know Paul from his AP Euro videos, but he does, AP Euro, AP Government bit by bit. Paul, go ahead.
Okay, well, hey, thanks for having me on here. And I don't really know what you guys have covered so far, but
well,
jump in and check it out.
Really quick, because they're waiting for you, Paul. And I'm going to go over something really, really quick to get you going. But the two topics that I know that you can deliver better than me is campaign finance, really talking about the difference between soft hard money, 527s, and the kids want fiscal federalism. So I think, if you want to do one of those next, they'd probably be cheering from the stands. But fiscal federalism was coming up in my head because Tom already mentioned federalism, right? Making sure you understand that. And Paul's going to go over fiscal federalism, which is really kind of this balance between the money coming from the feds and going to the states. But just make sure you know the different kind of evolutionary steps in federalism. And I'll say them real quick, and maybe we'll come back to them later. But Tom already kind of went over dual federalism, traditional federalism, where the 10th Amendment is the bedrock. If it's not in the Constitution, you're not doing it. The feds are doing their thing. The states are doing their thing. And then escalating after the Civil War to what sometimes is called layer cake federalism, where you're getting more power going to the federal government with things like the 14th Amendment, but it's really not being applied yet. And then the next big change, when we go into the New Deal and we get cooperative federalism, where the feds are really doing a lot more power. Creative federalism is on the test sometimes, and new federalism, but fiscal federalism really is kind of this relationship of money between the feds and the states. So Paul has come. Your sergeant is here, and we're going to let him rip something apart for you guys right now.
Well, I tell you, hey, thanks for saving me the fun stuff, the
I know
boring things, federalism, and what was it, campaign finance.
You can do whatever you want. They're on Twitter. They're asking millions of questions.
All right, so yeah, as you said, the fiscal federalism. So federalism is like this division of power between what's the state power, what's the federal power, and after the New Deal, you have the federal government that's really sort of inserting itself into a lot of areas that used to be state concerns. But then there became this sort of like clash between, how far is too far for the federal government? At what point do states have to stand up and say, these are really state powers which are reserved to us by the 10th Amendment? And so what the federal government started doing is the federal government started using fiscal federalism, fiscal meaning money. They started giving money to the states in order to sort of help them do things, and maybe sometimes in order to sort of coerce them to do things. And this is where, sometimes when you teach this stuff, you get a little bit, maybe you start sounding a little too conspiratorial, and maybe sometimes you sound a little bit too, nice, and the world's all great. So I'll give you both sides of this. If the happy-go-lucky, sunshiny kind of day fiscal federalism, oh gosh, the states don't have enough money to do everything really, really well. But the federal government has like tons and tons of cash. So what do? They give it out to the states. They allow the states different types of grants. We have categorical grants where states can apply to have money given to them by the federal government to help out with certain types of projects. They also have block grants. States love block grants because this is just money. It isn't really tagged to be spent in any real specific kind of way. They have a lot of discretion over how they spend it, but the federal government gives money to help states run their programs and run their programs well. It actually fights against one of the problems of federalism, which is that if you have a rich state, they might do things very well, and if you have a poorer state, then those social services or education or something like that might not get funded as well. And so federalism allows the federal government to kind of like equalize that a little bit. And so with these different types of grants, they can help the states build roads and run welfare systems and all kinds of different projects. On the other hand, fiscal federalism can be used, like the federal government money can be used to coerce the states to do stuff. So like if states don't want to necessarily jump on board with something, the federal government can say, hey, you know what? If you do jump on board, we'll give you some extra cash. Or on the other hand, hey, if you don't jump on board with this, we're going to withhold cash from you that we are already giving you. The great example of this is with raising the drinking age. When this was happening, the drinking age around the country, generally speaking, was 18. Mothers Against Drunk Driving went on a big campaign to try and get this raised to 21. And eventually what ended up happening is that the federal government started telling states that if they didn't, because states regulate the age of, the age to buy alcohol, if they didn't raise the age to 21, then they would no longer be receiving these highway funds that the federal government needs, millions and millions of dollars in highway funds that the federal government was giving out. And so, all of a sudden you have 50 states jump on board, and now they're all 21, and the roads are still getting paved. So fiscal federalism can be used both ways. It's the federal government inserting itself into what's traditionally state areas of policy and either helping them do it better or sort of coercing them to do it in a way that the national government wants it done. Did that kind of take care of things?
I think that's pretty good, man. I think you should prepare for campaign financing, and I'll answer a few other questions. We're giving you the good stuff. They won 527s, my friend. FEC, Citizens United. So in a general way, a lot of people, and Tom is much better at calling people out. He's like the meme guy. He knows everyone's freaking name. I don't, but I'm going to try and answer some questions. Everyone's asking about general advice, and I'm always afraid, because everybody's a different test taker, to give general test taking advice. But what I would say is, and Paul has taught this as long as I have, and he's still teaching it, Mr. Sargent, is there is a time crunch, man. 60 questions, 45 minutes. I'm looking for him to shake his head. Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's fast. So you don't want to get too hung up on a question. You don't want to kind of ponder for 5 minutes. Some people say answer it and move on. I was a fan of really quick. If I didn't know it, I'd give it a number, like a 3 was impossible, a 2 I'll go back to, or something like that. But have a system. That's the most important thing. I think going in loosey-goosey and not really thinking out how you're going to take that test probably won't serve you really well. In terms of those 3 responses, remember, there's 4, and guess how many you have to do? Yeah, no joke. You got to do all 4. I'm sure that you knew that already. So again, you can't bologna sandwich these. You have people that have been teaching these for 10, 20, 30 years that are grading your essays. You can't float stuff back by them that stinks. So, make sure you answer the questions they ask. You can't dance around the fire on those 3 responses. Even if you are running out of time and you do a bulleted list where you address directly what they're asking, it's better than getting a 0 on that free response. So you want to answer them all, and obviously write as much as you can to the questions. Don't BS. Don't go on weird tangents. It's not like a general ed course where they're going to be grading it up in the faculty room and they'll throw you a point here or there. They're really serious. So be serious when you're taking that exam and keep your eye on the clock. I'd say that. Really quickly, someone was asking about, oh, go ahead, Paul. Yeah.
I just want to jump in there because what I've been telling my students the last couple of years, and this is something that I think has changed the way they look at the FRQs, is I've stopped them thinking about them as 4 FRQs, because I think that that's really, it can be toxic. If you look at one and you think, wow, this is really hard, and then you look at the second one and this is pretty hard, all of a sudden you've got yourself thinking that you're going to fail half the FRQ section. So what I tell them is this: look through all 4 of them. And I have them, first of all, rank them in the order that they want to answer them, from the easiest to the hardest, 1 through 4. And then I teach them to go through and count the number of points that are available. So get this: anytime in an FRQ that the College Board gives you a direction to do something, identify this, explain this, describe this, any one of those action verbs, that's worth 1 point. And so you can count an FRQ and look, and they're going to be 5 or 6 points. And you can say, wow, there are 5 points here. Now, you might have looked at that and said, I don't think I know this. But if you look at it from a point perspective and you say, well, wait a minute, I know I can get this point, and I know I can get this second point, and I might be able to get this 3rd point out of 5. Hey, now that's not so bad. And so I don't want you to look at these as 4 FRQs. I encourage my students, look at them as, 20 to maybe 23, 24 total points, and then decide how many of those you can do and answer the parts first that you know well, because you're going to be real fresh at the beginning and you're going to be dying at the end of these 100 minutes. So the more you put up front, with like, you know, your good handwriting before it starts falling apart and your hand starts going numb, you know, and the more your thoughts go down on there and they're clear and concise and not just sort of rambling along like I seem to be now, then the better off you are. So so do all those parts up front and then count the points that you've gotten, and then, and this is key, use all the time. Go back. Make sure that you've covered everything. If there's a part of a question, this comes up a lot on FRQs where they say choose one of these two and, you know, describe or explain, you know, whatever it is. Well, you only have to answer one of them. But if you answer both of them because you happen to have some extra time left over, you could get one, maybe the first one you wrote down, you didn't quite get it right, but the second one you wrote down, you do get right. This is all about getting points, not about losing them. So spend the whole time. Cover your bases. Give as many examples as you can. Just write and write and write as much as you can.
That's really great advice. Really great advice going in. So remember that, guys. Be serious. Okay, just a couple smaller questions, and then we're going to hit campaign finance. Sargent's dying to go over it. He loves talking about it. He talks about it all the time. Like he tweets about it. He talks to his friends about it. So we'll get to him in a second. A couple like smaller things that you do need to know that have kind of popped up in the tweeter stream right there. Like what committees do I have to know? What are they going to ask about? And remember, there's different, you know, you have standing committees. Those are really the ones that you want to focus on. Standing means they're permanent committees, right? So in the House, the ones that you're going to see, the Rules Committee, that's really important because they put the rules together in the House. You have the Ways and Means Committee that deals with taxes and appropriations. I think those are the three that probably pop up the most on the exam. So, you know, especially knowing the Rules Committee and the Ways and Means Committee and Appropriations Committee in the House. In the Senate, you would go Appropriations, Judiciary, and Foreign Relations. Even just looking them up really quick, knowing basically what they do, you do want some standing committees in your tool belt to whip out, to write about a little bit, or if you get that free response. And remember the differences between the House and the Senate. This is kind of, you know, basic stuff, but you want to make sure that you understand there are differences. Simple ones we all know. House members, you know, are elected in districts. We talked about gerrymandering and how congressional districts are put together, but they serve every 2 years. And, you know, on a side note, that creates a humongous problem in terms of fundraising. You know, if you imagine 2 years is not a long time in politics, right? So as soon as they get elected, we go back to that iron triangle idea. They're looking for money, and that money generally doesn't come in through dollar donations. It's going to come in, you know, from these special interest groups. So maybe if you're on the left, you're raising money from pro-choice groups or environmental groups, and if you're on the hard right, maybe you're getting money from the NRA, whatever it might be. And then we go to that iron triangle. You know, you want that money to keep flowing, so you're going to support these types of laws and you know, things that are going to be supportive of those special interest groups, and then those bureaucracies are going to, you know, have low regulations. They're going to feed into it as well. But that's a big difference. House and Senate, 2 years in the House, constant running for re-election. The Senate, you can chill, baby, right? 6 years. And the idea is that you want them to be more deliberate. In a sense, they're more of a virtual representative body. They're supposed to like think more and, you know, kind of, you know, take the long view of things. We all know the 17th Amendment, of course, is going to change the original Constitution. Originally, the Senates were appointed by the state legislatures. And then during the progressive era, there's a lot of graft, there's a lot of corruption, there's a lot of, you know what I'm talking about. So the progressive movement's going to push for that 17th Amendment. And there's people that are against that today. They believe that it's not a good idea. But either way, that's a whole election in the whole state. Minor differences, but they're important. Tax policy, fiscal policy has to originate in the House. And the original reason for that is because they're most accountable to the people. In a sense, you know, they have to go back every 2 years and tell people what they did. I raised your taxes, elect me again. You know, so you have more accountability when it comes to financial stuff. And the House, I've always kind of thought, is more of kind of a chaotic institution. The speaker changes, they make up different rules. Everybody has a chance to kind of say something. There's a lot of noise, there's a lot of movement. What's the stupid box called? Is it called the hopper? I'm looking at Sargent.
The hopper?
I think it's called the hopper. There's like a name for the box they have to put their proposed legislation in.
Oh, that I don't know. I
think it's the hopper. Someone's going to Google it. If not, they should call it the hopper. But that's, you know, the House. In the Senate, you have different rules, right? The Senate's more of kind of a checker on the president. The Senate's going to review treaties. The Senate is going to have to approve judicial nominees. And in the Senate, you also have the filibuster. Now, that's been eroded over the last 5 or 10 years by both parties. But in terms of major legislation, this is important. If you're going to pass a huge thing, and of course, they're getting away with going around that now, too, with Obamacare and the tax policy. But generally, you need 60 votes in order to get permanent legislation. There's a name. What is the name, Paul, for the way that they're doing it? I forgot.
Well, right now they're passing those things through continuing resolutions. Is that what they're called?
Resolutions, right? So it's not permanent, right? It has to kind of be redone every once in a while. No?
Yeah, but it's attached to budgetary policy.
It's attached to budgetary policy, so they only need 50 votes rather than 60. But everyone's playing the game a little bit. Somebody asked about what sunshine laws are. Really quick, that I've seen that on multiple choice pop up. You want to know it. Basically, it's a transparency idea. If you think of sunshine being light to the darkness. So in the I think it was 1976, the Federal Sunshine Act was passed, and this is a kind of a effect of Watergate. And there's a lot of things that we see that come out of Watergate in terms of a more powerful Congress trying to take power from that imperial presidency, whether it's the War Powers Act or the 1976 Sunshine Act, which is going to be, in a sense, like the Freedom of Information Act. It's going to make sure that meetings are open to the public. It doesn't mean that you get to contribute, but you get to see the records. You get to at least hear what your government's doing, supposedly. So it's kind of an open transparency law. And you want to get that concept that, of imperial presidency, whether it's FDR being a really strong president or Nixon with foreign policy and other presidents like that. But Congress trying to kind of reclaim some of that power in the late 70s with things like the Sunshine Act and different laws like the War Powers Act to reclaim their power. And that happens a lot. We kind of have shifting power structures between the executive branch and the legislative branch. So what do you think, Sergeant, about these elections?
Well, I'll tell you what, one thing that I just want to sort of like expound upon that you talked about is sort of the chaos of congressional elections with the House. I mean, you do really have to think of it as like a constant re-election cycle, but you also have to realize, and I think this is important for the FRQs and for, my gosh, many states like, it's today, Wednesday, yesterday, and like next Tuesday, there are a lot of what they call safe congressional seats where there is no competition. I mean,
so red or so blue, no one bothers.
Yeah. So like for the last, I don't even remember how many years, Charlie Dent has been our representative. Now he's retiring because he's a very moderate Republican, and he's not really, he's a little too centrist for what's going on these days. But for the past few elections, like the Democrats haven't put anyone up against him. So it was a done deal. As long as one person checked the box next to Charlie Dent, he won re-election. So that there are a lot of seats where it is very safe.
It's non-competitive. And you have to remember, going back to that original kind of theory of government and under democracy of pluralism, that there's supposed to be in a term a move towards the center. When you have districts that are fairly balanced, there's a lot of Republicans, a lot of Democrats, some independents, maybe it's 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. There's an incentive for those Congress people to not be too radical on the left or right because they're not going to get reelected in the general. And what's happened because of gerrymandering in both blue and red districts is the opposite of effect. So if you're like Charlie Dent, and you want to move to the center to work with the other side to create good public policy, your butt's going to get primaried. You're going to have someone from the far right come in and go, you don't want this. This guy's not a real Republican, a real Democrat. And then what happens is, we get even further, tribalism in a sense, and, the deterioration of the republic. Look, a tear. So I want Paul to talk about, because the kids need it. I'm going to do alignment and realignment in a minute, and some big elections that you really should know, and kind of shifts in party ideology. But if they don't get campaign finance and 527s, they're going to be looking to string us up, Paul.
Hey, you know what? I'm gonna just give you the real basics here. Number one, I don't think you ever have to cite a dollar amount. People will obsess over how much an individual can contribute and how much PACs can contribute. Don't worry about it. As long as you understand that contributions are limited, I think you can get away with most anything that the College Board is going to throw your way. And also, it should be understood that these things are changing all of the time. You know, gerrymandering law is changing. In Pennsylvania, we just had a Supreme Court decision about the gerrymandering of this state. This test was probably written and approved at least 1.5 years ago. So anything that happened in the last 1.5 years probably won't be on this test. Although if it's something major that would make something wrong on the test, I'd hope they go back and change it. Anyway, so campaign finance has to do with this desire of money to get into the pockets of people who can do stuff. I like to think of it kind of like a flood, you know? You can hold back the water enough, but water flows downhill, and at some point it's going to find a way to get to the bottom of the hill. And no matter how many times you put up different obstructions in the way of water, or money in this case, like, the money's going to find a way into the bank accounts. What we don't want, though, is we don't want to have corruption. We don't want to have what we had at the turn of the 20th century, where a lot of politicians are literally in the pockets of big financial companies or really wealthy industrialists or stuff like that. We don't want that. We want these people to be representing our interests, and good old representative democracy in America kind of thing. But what tends to happen is that it's a two-way street. I mean, these politicians, they need money to run campaigns. People have money, but people don't want to just freely give money because it's just a really nice thing to do. They want something back from it. That's why you need some sort of regulation. And so Congress has tried to regulate, starting in the early 1970s, the amount of money and the ways that money can be contributed to campaigns. The Federal Election Campaign Act is sort of the big one that you should know right off the bat, and that sort of got the ball rolling, and it put limits on how much individuals could contribute to a campaign. But it ran into a problem where it limited every individual's contribution to a campaign, and so this was challenged in court. Was it legal to stop a person from contributing to his own campaign? And the Supreme Court said, well, no, you can't stop that. That's freedom of speech. It's their money. How can this person corrupt himself with his own money? It just can't happen. The other big thing to know, though, is that this created the political action committees, PACs. These had to be registered with the federal government. They had to keep track of all of their contributions to political campaigns. They were created just for that reason, by companies or by interest groups or something like that. And they would contribute to political campaigns. Political campaigns, then, on the other hand, had to keep track of all of the money that they brought in and all of the money they spent out. And they were regulated in what they were allowed to spend money on and where they were allowed to get money from. And there was an oversight component to make sure that they weren't being corrupted. Well, what really I think is a better explanation of all this is that the PACs are not as corruptive as we'd like to think. I think there may be an element of it, and certainly people can argue this both ways, but PACs are going to contribute to candidates that they are confident will not only win, but also are confident that they will uphold what they want. I've always told my students, like, if I was running for Congress, I would hope that the National Education Association would contribute to my campaign, because, I've been a teacher for a long time. And if I don't support education, then there's something wrong here. So they'll contribute to my campaign. That doesn't mean it's going to make me like education anymore. I already like education. But, they're going to give me money to try and get me in there so that my voice that likes education is going to be out there and pushing and helping them with their agenda. But not everyone's as nice as I am. So there were some corruptive elements. And so Congress came together in 2002 and passed what's the formal name is the Bipartisan Campaign Finance Reform Act of 2002, I believe. It's getting late. But the McCain-Feingold Act is what you'll probably see it listed as. And if they use the real name, then they're going to put McCain-Feingold in parentheses right there. And you go like, okay, yeah, it's the big, long official name, but it's the McCain-Feingold Act. So this actually tried to dry up what was called soft money. A lot of people were getting around the campaign finance laws by contributing money, not to a candidate, but to the party. So you don't give to you're a Republican presidential candidate, you give to the Republican Party. And the Republican Party then goes in and they promote Republicanism and voting Republican. And, all the flyers that came out with your money just happen to have the picture of the president who you really want to give the money to on it, So it was kind of like, again, money finds a way. And so they passed this, which banned soft money, but it opened up some other loopholes. And these other groups started to appear. 527s you might see on the exam. And these are groups which are created in this one little tiny little part of the law. And they're allowed to create political ads as long as they're not affiliated with a campaign, as long as they're not endorsed. Yeah, right. Yeah, wink, wink, right? So when John Kerry was running for president in 2004, we had all these Swift Boat Veterans for America ads that came out, and they literally, they were bashing John Kerry, who was running against then incumbent President George W. Bush. And they were slamming him for his Vietnam War record. And then at the end of everyone, it was like, oh, and this is in no way meant to, no way endorsed by the George W. Bush campaign. It happens to attack the guy he's running against pretty hard, but, it's not endorsed by him. So that's okay, And that was further opened up in 2008. 2009 with the Citizens United case, which is another one that I think you should know, which said that free speech actually allows groups to create political messages if they're not associated with a campaign. And the people who contribute to the groups that create these things, I know this is getting complicated, but it's, campaign finance, and it all makes sense up here, so I'm trying. The groups that create it, they don't have to tell who their donors are. They don't have to tell who gives the money. They just can make stuff, and they can put out all kinds of ads. We saw these ads hitting the airwaves all over the place in this last presidential election, and so unlimited money. You don't have to say who's paying for it. You can put the ads up. You just don't say magic words like vote for or elect. Or, you don't suggest that you're associated with the campaign at all. So, has campaign finance been successful? I don't know.
I don't think so. Maybe.
It's hard to make rules when the people who make the rules are the ones who benefited from the rules not being there in the first place.
Yeah, it's definitely muddled and ugly, and we apologize for that, but it's still going to be on the test. So what are you going to do? So I just tweeted, if you guys don't know Mr. Sargent's Twitter, so you can start tagging him instead of Tom Ritchie, and you can fill his I almost said his love box, but that's disgusting. His tweet box with lots of questions we haven't answered. It's late and I was inappropriate.
My hopper.
Your hopper. I think it's called a hopper. Someone Google it and let me know. I think it's called the hopper. You put the box on. So a couple of separate things that people have been asking. People are asking about checks and balances. Guys, you have to go and watch these videos, man. We can't go over things that, you probably should have learned in U.S. history. So I'm going to do this really quick, and then I am going to hit some alignment and realignment, some important elections, which that'll pop up in free response sometimes. And we'll ask specifically about some of these ideas about the shifts of the demographics of political parties. And we're going to talk about that in a second. And Selective Incorporation, again, because I do want to go over some specific cases with you that are kind of activist cases and restraint cases, so you can write about them, and some cases that are related to the 14th when it comes to civil rights. So we're going to do that, but really quick, because you guys are ding-dong sometimes. We're going to switch right here, right? We're going to go there. Okay, do share, and then open that up. So all you got to do, guys, is go to just like HipHughes.com. That'll take you to my website, and Paul can show you his stuff too. But that video arsenal button, we can't go over everything. We have another hour. We can go over another 10 or 20% of the test. And I don't have everything, but between me, Paul, and Tom, and some other cats out there, there's videos that are out there, 5 to 10 minutes, that are going to help you out. So if I click that political button, Southern strategy, all about de-alignment, alignment, about, the Democratic Party, which used to be the party of the South, how that moved to be the party of the North and the other way around. Sorry, Paul?
Nothing. Sorry.
What you could see in here, there's lots of Supreme Court jive, so you can get all of your, Latin terms down and stuff like that. So, we don't have to do this forever, but please check that out. You can pause us talking heads and come back to us. We're not going anywhere. And this video is going to upload when we're done anyway. So use your nuts and bolts to get the best study session tonight. And don't stay up to 2 in the morning. I don't want to sound like your dad, but you got to get some sleep, man. Your brain's not going to be working on, the full V8 tomorrow if you're going to bed at 2 in the morning and getting up at 7 to take the test. So as stupid as it sounds, go to bed, by 10:30, 11 o'clock, get some sleep, have some breakfast, so you're operating on your full engines. So let's talk a little bit about these court cases, because I want you to have some simple ones, so your brain's not scrambling for what to write about. You don't have to write about obscure, weird cases. You can stick to some of these basic ideas. But we go back to kind of the thing we started off really quick in the beginning. Make sure you know Marbury versus Madison, right? Make sure you understand how this unwritten power, it's unwritten, this idea of them being, the oversiders of federal law kind of comes from themselves in Marbury versus Madison. And McCulloch and Gibbons. I usually group those together because those are your Marshall cases, John Schwarzenegger Marshall, your strength cases. And then basically the concepts that you need to know. We're going to talk about selective incorporation really quickly again, but it's basically judicial activism versus judicial restraint. And what I always do is activism is when you stretch the Constitution, whether you're doing it with the 14th Amendment or elastic or interstate, or whether you're more of a traditionalist, a conservative like a Scalia, an originalist who wants to restrain the federal government and the Constitution by ruling directly on the words themselves and not what current events or current feelings might be about. So once you get that 14th Amendment, right, you want to make sure you understand selective incorporation, because in the slaughterhouse cases, when these slaughterhouse guys go to the Supreme Court and they go, 14th Amendment me, no state shall deny its citizens. I'm a citizen of a state. Due process, equal rights. That's my business we're talking about. The court lays down the law by saying, no, this is about civil rights. This is about freedmen. And then they kind of don't do that in Plessy versus Ferguson. They're like, psych. But then selective incorporation takes on kind of a new life with Gitlow versus New York, when the Supreme Court rules that we can use the 14th Amendment to selectively incorporate freedom of speech, that part of the First Amendment, to all of the states by saying, New York, you wronged Gitlow. You violated the federal Constitution with your state law. That opens up the floodgates. Now we don't just have to selectively incorporate the First Amendment, but we can selectively incorporate parts of the Fourth Amendment, parts of the Fifth Amendment, parts of the Sixth Amendment. So whether it's Gideon versus Wainwright, very simple case, right? The guy doesn't have a lawyer. He's going to get screwed. He's going to jail. I think he was guilty anyway, but he couldn't afford a lawyer, right? So what the Supreme Court says basically is, Gideon versus Wainwright. What is it? What's Gideon? Illinois?
Florida.
Florida. It's in Florida. That's right. The state's not in the name, so I didn't know, right? But basically, they go, Florida, you're violating not your own state constitution, but you're violating the federal Constitution. So we're going to use that 14th Amendment like a crane, right, to pick up that part of the Bill of Rights that deals with you have a right to an attorney, and kind of give that to all the states. So if you can't afford one, not just in Florida, but Alabama, Alaska, Arizona, California, Colorado, Connecticut, all of the states, that's selectively incorporated, right? Gideon versus Wainwright, Miranda versus Arizona. How can you not know Miranda? You have the right to, oh my God, right? Watch the video. That's selective incorporation, right? Another really great court case is I love Mapp versus Ohio. I call it the dirty little old lady court case. You nasty little old lady. Got pornography in her basement. But that idea, there's nothing, in Ohio that stops them from using evidence against this lady. They're there. Don King was involved in that court case. Yeah. They were looking for someone like in a Don King circle, and they went to her house. You can Google it. But nevertheless, they weren't there to find this pornography in her basement. But that's going to happen, and they're going to use that not having a warrant. So in Mapp versus Ohio, selectively incorporating, using the 14th Amendment, that Fourth Amendment search warrant clause, and creating a new rule for all the states. You've watched Law and Order. You know what happens when they get the evidence illegally. But the bigger point, not only is selective incorporation, that these are activist court cases. That's the Warren Court. That's the Warren Court taking words that might not be in the Constitution and saying that's the meaning of the Fourth Amendment. How can the Fourth Amendment mean anything? That you have to have a search warrant. Okay, well, we're not going to do it. What are we going to do? We're going to use the evidence against you. So even though Warren says it doesn't say in there you have to throw the evidence out, we're making that rule. So we're going to expand the Constitution and the meaning of the Fourth Amendment, and we're going to selectively incorporate it. So that makes people like Scalia's head explode, because they're restraint artists. They're the ones that are saying, no, you can't do that. We have to limit what's in the Constitution. If you want that law, go to the state, pass it there, change it through, representation, not through the referees. So really quick, and then we're going to turn it over to Paul. He's probably got some questions he's been looking up on the Twitter in his love box. Is these restraint court cases, right? A couple of them, really simple ones. You know them already. You know Plessy. I know you knew Korematsu. I know you understand that we locked up Japanese Americans during World War II. I know you understand that they're saying, what about habeas corpus? What about basic stuff in the Bill of Rights? You're violating that. And the court's saying, too bad, right? Or in, what's the other one I'm always thinking of? Is Schenck, right? Is Schenck? Yeah, clear and present danger, right? So that's a restraint court case as well with the First Amendment, by saying that we're going to limit what the First Amendment means by saying there's a clear and present danger clause. You can't say anything you want. So at least have some court cases that are activists, like the Warren Court, some restraint court cases, and that understanding the Bill of Rights and selective incorporation are being used with that 14th Amendment to incorporate some of the Bill of Rights to the states. All right, I'm going to stop. I can't do the alignment thing yet. I'll do that next after Paul goes.
All right, well, let me just add to what you said with the incorporation thing, because one of the things that you have to understand when you're describing these, now this is really more of an FRQ tip than it is a multiple choice tip, but like you have to be really, really careful when you're talking about Supreme Court cases on FRQs, because you have to, especially in corporation cases, you can't simply say like the Miranda case made it so that so that people have to have their rights read to them. What you have to say is that the Miranda case mandated that states cannot use what someone says as evidence unless they've been informed that they have the right to remain silent. And so the wording sometimes of these cases can get you in trouble, because you think you know what you're going to talk about, and then you write about it, and it doesn't end up actually describing what's really going on. So incorporation, always, whenever you're talking about incorporation, mention the states. Okay, mention the states. States cannot do this. States are required to do such and such. I mean, look, the reality is, after Miranda, the police officers do not have to read me my rights if they arrest me. But they do have to read me my rights if they want to use anything that I say against me in court. They can arrest me, not read me my rights, and I can, like, wouldn't suggest this as like a
I get it.
action.
I hereby murdered him. I do it.
You just go off and just say all kinds of stuff, and it's not admissible in court. But I don't know that I'd test the system by doing that. I mean,
no, I wouldn't do that either. It's a new Supreme Court. Don't do it.
Right, and we talk about all of these names. I mean, Gideon and Miranda and Schenck and all these guys, like, their names are enshrined in American legal history. But that doesn't mean that I want my name enshrined in.
No, you don't want to be the new precedent.
Right. I mean, Gideon was years in jail trying to teach himself law so that he could take this to the Supreme Court. Like, you don't want that, okay? But I don't even remember where I was going to go after that. Just totally lost.
Yeah, I've been blanking out too. You got to do something. I got to prepare for the election.
Right. So one of the things that I think people are asking a lot about is the whole idea of checks and balances. Like, what is it that you need to know? Here's what I would do. Your government book, whether you're looking at a review book, whether you're looking at a textbook, whether you just want to search it online, it's got a triangular diagram, and it has the three branches of government and the ways that they can check each other. But and I would look at it, and I would maybe memorize it. I would maybe, like, sit there and just stare at it long enough that when you go into the AP exam, you can close your eyes and, like, you can still see it. If you're able to do that, it's really good. But if you can't, let me just give you a couple of quick ones, okay? Whenever it comes to the courts, they have the ability to rule things in violation of the Constitution. They can decide that an act or that a law, like an act being like something that a part of the government does, something that the president does. They can rule that unconstitutional. They can rule laws unconstitutional. They can rule executive orders unconstitutional. They can rule lots of things unconstitutional. So that's the one, like, go-to for the courts. The president is the head of the executive branch. He's the one with all of his various bureaucratic agencies that enforce the law. So If they want to check a different branch, they can simply not enforce whatever the branch decided to do. If it's Congress passing a law, the president can find ways not to enforce the law as fully as Congress might want them to. If the court decides a case, then the president may decide not to enforce the ruling of the case as much as they want to. I mean, we look back at Brown versus Board of Education, and when 9 students who are African American tried to go to high school in Little Rock, Arkansas, I mean, they wouldn't have been able to because the state police stopped them. The National Guard was brought in to stop them, and it was only through Eisenhower, the president of the United States, actually nationalizing the National Guard, federalizing the National Guard, and bringing in actually the 101st Airborne in order to basically create a military zone around Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. Like, that's what made those kids be able to go to school. And it was a message to states that were trying to keep segregated schools going that, like, hey, the federal government isn't going to stand for this. We're enforcing this court ruling. And then you come to Congress, and this is the one I want you to remember. I remember this one, the power of the purse, the cash, baby. That's where it is. The money, the money, the money. Okay. These guys, yes. I mean, Congress literally can make it rain money. I mean, yeah, that's not really rain. That's just like a little bit of sprinkling. Congress has trillions. They can throw like trillions of dollars. This is a downpour. Okay. But they can decide what to fund and how much to fund it. And so if you ever get stuck on how can Congress check the power of whatever, oh my gosh, money, power of the purse. That's the way to go with it. It's a nice little shortcut on all 3 of the branches.
Nice. I'll do a couple of elections really quick. And I know if I skim the surface on iron triangles, but maybe when I'm done, Sergeant, if you want to do a specific example of a strong iron triangle for the kids, so they have that example. Look at that right there. You see what that says?
The Hopper.
It's the Hopper. So thank you, Madison Miller.
I wonder if it's nicknamed Dennis.
Maybe it's Dennis Hopper. They call it the Easy Rider, the Easy Rider box.
Yeah, that's what they attach to the bills.
So there is a kind of a part of kind of, the political party system that you should know. We're not going to go over all of that. I have videos. There's videos out there for you, whether it's the Feds and the Democratic Republicans moving into the Jacksonian Democrats by the 1820s, the birth of, through the Free Soil Party to the Republican Party in 1860. There's a lot of times it's third parties that kind of introduce people to move from one party to another party. And these are the terms of alignment. De-alignment basically means when there's people that are attached to a political party that for whatever reason are going to detach. I used to make the suction sound out like pop, like they're going to leave that party, right? So a real simple example, and you don't want to use too many old examples. We're going to talk about maybe 1980 or 68 in a minute. But, if you look at who's voting for Republicans in 1860 and afterwards, right? Well, it's the party that freed the slaves, right? And even though it's really a party of economic nationalism, right? Lincoln's for limited government. He's a Republican, but he believes in pro-business policies. He wants free labor out west. He wants the government to build the railroad. But those freedmen, those millions of African Americans that are going to be freed after the Civil War, they're going to be Republicans, baby, right? They're going to have Lincoln up on the wall. Today, how many African Americans are still in the Republican Party, right? 5%, 4%, 10%, whatever you're going to say. So through whatever reason, something happened where they de-aligned from the Republican Party. And a really easy election, you go to 1932, right? Why is an African American going to vote for the Democratic Party, the party of the South, the party of states' rights, the party that defended the expansion of slavery and the institution of slavery? Because the Democratic Party is going to offer them something the Republican Party is not offering them, namely jobs, economic mobility, right? The CCC or the WPA, all those New Deal programs, investment in themselves. So they've de-aligned from the Republican Party, and they're going to start realigning with the Democratic Party. And as we go on through different elections, they're going to stick with that party because that party is serving their needs in a sense. And you could use the opposite example it used to be that white people in the South, right, most were Democrats. They were Democrats because they believed in states' rights. They believed the federal government's overreaching. They loved the 10th Amendment, whatever the reason is. But something happened, right? Because that's red now, right? Most of those states are really, really deeply red. So something occurred. And it could be civil rights, right? As the Democratic Party starts to pick up on civil rights, right? Even Eisenhower, a Republican, who's going to, in a sense, start pushing, the federal government to do civil rights stuff, whether it's the 64 Civil Rights Act or the Voting Rights Act or whatever it might be. They're not going to be a fan of that. And at the same time, as they de-align, let's say in 64, 56, right around there, as the Dixiecrats started popping up in the Southern elections, the Republican Party is going to find a way to offer them something. And that's going to be really Richard Nixon who's going to do it the best. And he's going to do it through law and order policies, right? That we need safe streets, that we need you, to be able to, be successful without having to worry when you go outside, whatever it might be. Some people call that dog whistle politics. Some people think that he's speaking maybe to, I don't want to say a racist tone, but that might work for some people. So they're going to realign for the Republican Party. And there's other policies that they're probably going to like too, whether it's tax cuts that the Republicans believe in. But the idea of realignment and de-alignment, another election you want to look at is 1980, right? Ronald Reagan is really going to take blue-collar Democrats like Archie Bunkers of the world, people that work in steel mills, and he's going to make them align with the Republican Party, whether it's because he's nationalistic or he's a great communicator or he believes in tax cuts or less regulation, getting the government monkey off your back. But that idea that voters move from parties depending on what those parties represent and stand for is an important idea. And get a couple of elections under your belt, whether it's 68, Richard Nixon, Hubert Humphrey, right? Yeah, Hubert Humphrey, or Reagan and Carter in 1980. Those are two great elections. There's other great elections, but the concept of alignment, realignment, de-alignment. Mr. Sargent.
Well, and I think that this plays into a question that I saw going through on the Twitter feed, which is all about public opinion. I mean, look, if you've only got two viable parties out there, the Republican and the Democratic Party, they're both essentially going to represent 50% of the country in any given moment. If they've done their homework and they're kind of feeling each other out, they can represent 50% pretty well. Okay, maybe 45, maybe the 5% on the outskirts you don't worry about because they're never going to vote the other way. But they're going to represent about half the country. And so they're always looking for ways to get that majority vote. In other words, how do you get the people who are sitting in the middle to shift from the opposition party to your side? And public opinion polling is really a good way to do that. You go through and you do scientific polling, and scientific polling involves random sampling of people. And you try and find out what it is that the voters want, what they have in their heads, what they want candidates to say, how they like different candidates, how they think an office holder is doing while in office, whatever it may be. You try and get a feel for the pulse of the people. Then, as a party, the parties try and find the message that will resonate with enough voters to get the victory in any given election. And sometimes they do this very well, and sometimes they actually totally mess this thing up because they just don't get it right. It's a very, very difficult thing to get right. The hardest thing for the Democratic Party is that they have a numerical advantage in the number of people who identify with Democratic politics, but many of those people are from groups which historically don't show up and actually vote. And so getting out the vote is their real problem. Republicans have a numerical minority. There are a few people who identify strongly with Republican policies, but those people show up very reliably to vote. You can count on them being there on a Tuesday morning, standing in the rain, waiting in line, whatever they have to do with their red hats on, getting ready to put down the vote. And so with public opinion polling, the idea is that campaigns and candidates will try and figure out what's going to get the most people out there, what's going to get them the win. The win is what they need. And then with the information they have, they try and develop a strategy for that campaign. Now, a great example of this, all we have to do is go back to the 2016 election. This was one that every political pundit had said this thing is no doubt a Hillary Clinton victory.
I had
But
to put my pinky off because of it.
but the Trump campaign was able to tap into a demographic that had been somehow overlooked in public opinion polls, and this is sort of the lower middle class white voter who feels like the America that they've known is slipping away, and that the intellectuals in the big cities are trying to sort of push down their ideas onto the people. Do you have something there to show? Oh, I thought you were.
No, I don't want. I was thinking about it because, well, Richie wouldn't like it if I did it, but I do have orange flavored "Make America Great" gummies. Look at that.
Oh,
that's my shout out.
I got you one better.
What's that? Oh, get out! You got the bobblehead.
The bobblehead. Yes, I actually have a Hillary Clinton bobblehead as well. But I kid you not. I kid you not. Like, her legs broke off about 2 days after the election. And it wasn't like a sabotage or anything. Like, it was weird.
Maybe it was the Russians. Huh? How about that?
Maybe.
Okay, I'm going to go over a couple things. Sergeant, bureaucracies would be something that maybe you can talk about when I'm done with this, if you're comfortable.
Always give me the fun stuff.
Well, that's why you're here, brother. That's why you're here. And you're really good at it. Shout out to Chelsea Brown. And sexy Tim equals fun Tim. Dude, you should change your Twitter today. Like, that's a little bit creepy. But you did ask a great question, which is about devolution, which is a really great word. So I want to talk give you a couple of examples. I'll give you an operational definition, and we'll give you some samples of devolution. But, we talked a little bit about, federalism, right? And I usually rip paper. Paul said it. Tom said it. But it's this idea that, power is so sacred that in our government, federalism is the division of power, right, between that federal government, what's in the Constitution, and the states get everything else. That's that 10th Amendment, reserved power. We talked a little bit about dual federalism, the way that it was set up in the Constitution. Paul talked about a little bit about the evolution of federalism, through the New Deal, layer cake and marble cake, creative and fiscal. But then there comes this take back time. Nixon believed in it, Reagan believed in it, and even Clinton with the new Democratic Party is going to go along with it as well. And we'll talk about the contract with America. But devolution is returning power to the states, right? So believers in the 10th Amendment, believing that the federal government went too far, we need to reclaim, more of a dual federalistic approach. So this is big in the 90s, and Newt Gingrich, who was the Speaker of the House at that time, introduced a document called the Contract with America, with all of these different kind of points of what we should do to return power to the states. And not much of it happened because you had a Democratic president. But at the same time, even when presidents in the day didn't get along with Congress, they still worked together. The Speaker of the House when Reagan was in there, it was Tip O'Neill, and Tip O'Neill and Reagan, they'd eat together all the time. They would split the bill and talk about policies. And I don't know if Gingrich and Clinton did that, but they did work together a little bit. So we get welfare reform out of that. Bill Clinton signed off on that. And in a sense, it's trying to shrink the federal government's responsibility of people being dependent on it in the states. That's devolution. When you're trying to limit the scope of the federal government. I'm going to look at Paul as I say this, but I believe block grants, in a sense, is that devolutionary, right? Because you're returning power to the states rather than the federal government coming up with a formula, a categorical formula grant, and saying you have to spend the money this way. We're giving states more power. And again, it's based on that 10th Amendment concept. What amendments do you have to know? All of them. Well, you should definitely know, the big ones, right? Obviously, it's how you apply them. And they're not going to ask you, what's the First Amendment say? But being able to, to use them within those free responses to explain those court cases, it's probably too late to know all of them, but fly through my constitutional playlist, pick some of those big ones, get that 10th Amendment down, get that 14th Amendment down, and at least the big ones, 1, 2, 4, 5. I don't know what to tell you. You don't have to memorize them all at this point. The AP exam, I think, is much more of a how you use stuff rather than on the essays, rather than just knowing stuff. I think both are probably important. but definitely understand federalism within devolution, but also the larger scope that it's expanded, right? We might be shrinking a little bit, but it's much more than traditional dual federalism probably ever saw how it was going to be in the future. Some real big clauses you need to know. The three big ones we've mentioned before, and all of them, in a sense, kind of counteract that 10th Amendment a little bit. You have the elastic clause. The elastic clause, a lot of people misunderstand. They say, oh, the elastic clause says Congress shall make all laws necessary and proper. Not anything. It has to be attached to wording in, Article 1, Section 8 of that list of delegated powers. So when you say the national bank's not in the Constitution in McCulloch versus Maryland, you're right, it's not. But there are other pieces about, whether it's coining money or things you can connect to a national bank. And that's where the elastic clause becomes, in a sense, a bridge between the language in the Constitution and maybe an entity that doesn't exist in the Constitution. The interstate commerce clause, right? Giving the federal government the ability to regulate things that cross state lines. So whether it's airplanes or the air or rivers, that's in a sense paired with that elastic clause going to allow the federal government to do some things that some people might disagree with. They might say that's not in the Constitution, but the Supreme Court might rule because of the interstate commerce clause, the federal government might have more of a scope in health insurance or in clean air or whatever it might be. And then the supremacy clause, and that's kind of not exactly the same thing, but if it's gives the federal government supremacy over the states, as long as we're talking about stuff in the Constitution or stuff that can be connected to the Constitution. You can't just pass a law saying free ice cream for everybody. Maybe you can. Now I want ice cream. Bureaucracy.
Why not? Why not? Actually, bureaucracy ties right into what you were just talking about, because, if the states are given, if there's a federal law which governs what states can and cannot do, and the states find ways to get around it, it can be an element of the bureaucracy, one of the great examples of this is marijuana legislation being passed throughout the country. States are experimenting with medical marijuana laws. Some states are experimenting with recreational marijuana laws, but marijuana is still totally illegal from a federal standpoint.
And it's a controlled drug class 1 too. It's in the same category as heroin and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, this is the worst kind of drug out there. And so and so how does this happen? Well, what happened was during the Obama administration, in order to allow federalism to kind of work, to allow these states to be little laboratories and try out drug policies with marijuana, the Obama administration didn't get the law changed, but he simply directed the Justice Department, basically the FBI and the not alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, but the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, basically directed them to not enforce federal marijuana laws in states that have decided to pass their own medical or recreational marijuana laws. So the states are making these laws, which are totally unconstitutional from a supremacy clause standpoint, but the bureaucracy, those agents of the government, all those little agencies that actually do all of the work, and I say little, but they're really, really, really huge, they are the ones who are there and implementing this stuff. And this is one of the most misunderstood parts of this entire course, because, maybe some teachers, I know some teachers are better than me, but I can't seem to make the bureaucracy interesting. But basically, when I think about the bureaucracy, I think about all of the people that work for the federal government. They're not elected, so we're not talking about congressmen or the president or something like that. These are people who have a career working in the government. They work for the State Department. They're FBI agents. They're in the CIA. They're looking over my taxes at the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service. They're deciding who should be on the $20 bill. Should it be Harriet Tubman or should it be Andrew Jackson over at the Department of the Treasury? They're working at the Smithsonian looking at some really old fossil bone, and we're paying for all of it. Okay, the bureaucracy is enormous, and it's carrying out all of the laws. But the bureaucracy has a real power. because they have the ability to decide how to implement the laws which are passed. Let's face it, when you get a bunch of people in a room trying to pass a law, it tends to get vague in places in order just to make everybody happy. The more specific it gets, the more you start to upset people. And so by making them a little bit vague, you can get the law passed and then allow it to be implemented. And then if there's a problem with that, then, you know, deal with it later kind of thing. So let's say that Congress decides to pass a law saying that we're in a time of crisis after 9/11. And so, you know, we really need to keep an ear out on communications electronically for, you know, terrorists or something.
Keep
And then,
it out.
and then, yeah. And so then, you know, they give power to the National Security Agency to monitor information about terrorists. The National Security Agency decides that the most efficient way to look for terrorists is simply to like tap into every single electronic communication that's passing through the United States, AT&T or Sprint or Verizon or, you know, Comcast or any of these guys. They literally grab everything and then they run algorithms and search for them. And then, okay, then, you know, they're doing this, and is it, you know, we don't know about it until we have this whistleblower, Snowden, who comes out and says like, oh my gosh, look what they're doing. They're literally listening in on everybody and gathering data on everybody. And Congress gets all upset about it. They start exerting their oversight responsibility. In other words, their ability to look and see how the government or how the bureaucracy is implementing the law they put in place. And they realize that they're overreaching. And so they direct the National Security Agency to pull back on those programs and to not use them on American citizens who are not specifically under investigation. And so the bureaucracy has the power to be able to decide what to do with legislation, and to be able to decide who to audit, whose taxes to audit, decide which planet they should send a spaceship to go try and civilize. You know, whatever it is, the bureaucracy decides how to do these things, and it gives them the power, which is at least as powerful as any other branch of government.
Because it's the verb behind government, and sometimes it's called the fourth branch of government because of that very reason. And it's also important to note that the heads of these bureaucracies are appointed in many cases by the president. So it's kind of their wish list. So if you have an environmental president like Obama, the head of the EPA is going to read those rules, which Paul said are, you know, written kind of loosely, in order to protect more land or save more animals or cut down less trees or whatever it might be. But when Trump comes in and he'll put something like Scott Pruitt into the EPA, they have a different view on the role of the EPA, which is less regulation. So if you take something like the Superfund, you know, a huge amount of money that's supposed to be used to clean up toxic dumps, they have discretion on how they spend that now. And there might be, you know, something weighing in their mind of, you know, maybe more pro-business, pro-oil company or something like that. But those bureaucracies, whether it's the EPA or whether it's the, you know, the NSA or, you know, ICE, you know, and immigration, we saw this through DACA and how Obama used discretion in prioritizing who we're going to go after. So maybe leaving alone the kids for a little while, or the, you know, the people that aren't violating the law. Trump has a different perspective on that. So by the bureaucracy has an enormous amount of power. We don't want you just to see it as people that are pressing buttons, but it's people, like Paul said, Mr. Sargent, that are enacting policy. They're the ones that put verbs. They're the ones where you see what's happening on your street or down the road or in your computer or in your microwave. They're watching through your microwave. I think I heard that somewhere. I can't do shout outs. Tom is so good at the stupid shout outs. Like Kristen Knox said she'd get a 5 if I gave her a shout out. Like if I didn't give her a shout out, she wouldn't get a 5. She'd like get stuff wrong on purpose. Mackenzie Cassidy, I can't do this. I just can't. I don't have it in me. I want to talk a little bit about just the very basic, like how a bill becomes a law. At least the very, very basic.
Song about that?
What's that?
Watch like Schoolhouse Rock and get that.
Watch the Schoolhouse Rock song. There you go.
Follow it up with the Saturday Night Live thing about executive orders, and you know you got the whole idea.
You'll all get 5s for sure. but understanding at least, you know, people seem to think like, oh, someone has an idea for, they put a bill up and everyone votes on the bill. You know, you have to understand that the vast majority of bills die before anyone even hears their name. There is apparently a hopper, though. So, you know, once those bills get submitted, you know, you don't just have committees. We talked about standing committees like, House Ways and Means Committee deals with tax policy or something like that. You have subcommittees. You have like mirrors and mirrors and mirrors. So those bills, they go through markups and changes, and most of them die. Maybe it's a special interest that doesn't like her. It's a congressman that, it's not going to favor their district or whatever it might be. That's why it's so important to Congress people to get important committees, because, you have to go back to your district and tell them, you don't want to go back and say, I'm on the committee of nothingness. You want to go back with, appropriations committee, right? It means you're appropriating the money. You're deciding where the money is going to go. And maybe it's going to go to build that new NASA Space Center in my backyard. So being on the right committee means a lot. But back to that idea, most of those bills die in subcommittees or in committees. And then you have, the Rules Committee and the Speaker of the House, enormous power in the House to decide what's going to go to the floor and when it's going to be voted on or if it's going to be voted on. And if by chance something does pass, this goes back to 8th grade, right? You have to get the same legislation in the Senate, the same language, and they're not going to have the same language. There's no way, especially the Senate. The Senate kind of looks down at the House, I think, a little bit. They're gonna write it differently. They have different constituencies too. They're not just appealing to District 16 in Ohio, in Pig Farm District. They have to get votes from Cleveland and the suburbs and all over Ohio. So they're probably going to change that legislation. Now, I'm missing vocabulary. Once those bills are passed, if they're different, is it conference committee, Paul, or joint? It's conference.
Yeah, it's conference committee, and the conference committee, like I think it's really important to understand like how difficult this is, because I mean, we literally the bill has to be exactly the same. There's a comma missing.
Yeah, no go.
The Senate decides they're not going to use the Oxford comma. All of a sudden, you got different bills, and you have to sit down. And so they bring together a conference committee to fix those differences. Now, hopefully, like the comma thing, they could probably work out pretty quickly.
Right.
But it's a matter of $1 billion, then they might have to talk about it for a little while.
And obviously, if they do get that same language, it has to go back to the House and the Senate to get voted on. And that puts people in very sometimes bad predicaments, where the president's pressuring them. You got to vote for this. John McCain was under immense pressure to vote for that Obamacare repeal bill, and he didn't. And he stopped his party from winning that battle. So a lot of pressure. But eventually, obviously, you've watched you've heard the song. Goes the president. If the president signs it, it's all good. If he vetoes it, it goes back to the House and the Senate, where it needs a 2/3 override. It's very rare because of our kind of, factionalized Congress and, Senate and House. That very rarely happens. And then there's something called a pocket veto. And I'm going to wing this. Is it 15 days? I'm looking at Paul.
10 days.
10 days.
10
so
days.
If the president does nothing for 10 days, it's automatically vetoed?
Yeah. So, well, not exactly. What it says in the Constitution is that if the president has 10 days to sign or veto the law, and if he doesn't do that, then I'm sorry, I say he simply because we haven't had a female president yet, and it's nice and shorthand. But anyway, then that bill automatically goes back to Congress, and Congress, with a simple majority vote, can then make it a law without the president's signature on it. Now, they already got the simple majority in order to get it through to the president. But what if the president doesn't want to veto a bill because it could be like a politically bad idea, and he doesn't really want to sign the bill because he doesn't really like it all that much? But oh my goodness, look at this. Congress passed this bill right before they went away on recess for Christmas. And so they're all at home. So the president just kind of holds on to it for the 10 days. And when the 10 days are over and it's supposed to go back to Congress, oh, look, there's no Congress. They're all under the Christmas tree, like, unwrapping the presents. And so the bill dies. And so the president can use this pocket veto so that he doesn't have to actually veto a bill. But I mean, really, these things have to be timed perfectly. Now, what tends to happen, though, is that Congress tends to run themselves right up to these deadlines where they're going to go on recess, and then they go gangbusters. They literally stay up all night. You get these 3 a.m. votes where the Senate is like, 3 a.m. And you wonder how some of these guys are even like alive at that time of night, but they go through and they're like, yes, I vote for it. Please just let me go home. I live in California, it's winter here. And they vote on these things, and then boy, now it gets sent over to the president. And I just saw another thing, since we're talking about pocket vetoes. I saw something fly through the chat here about the line item veto. Now, please understand, the line item veto is a thing where the president could theoretically get, especially like a spending bill. You got a whole bunch of different monies going all over the place, and he could like things out and go like, yeah, we're not doing that, we're not doing that, we're not doing that, and then he could sign it. Most governors of states have this ability, but the president of the United States does not have it. Congress tried to give it to him, to Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton took out some funding for some program in the city of New York. They sued him, saying that the line item veto is actually not in the Constitution. The Supreme Court said, yeah, you're right, it's not. So if you want the line item veto, you got to get Congress and the states to change the Constitution, because you don't have the line item veto. Now, the line item veto is talking about, it is being talked about more these days with, President Trump saying, well, maybe he should have the line item veto, and you should try that out.
And think about what an enormous shift that would be to the president in terms of power if they were allowed basically just to knock whatever they want out of the law and keep the good parts and get rid of the bad parts. So the Supreme Court, I think, rightly said, if you want that, if you really want that, you have to go through the hard knocks policy of amending the Constitution. And remember, people think the Constitution is sacred, and maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but there's a reason you're allowed to change it. There's a process in there to change it. So remember, we have 27 amendments. I don't know if we'll ever get the 28th with the way our politics works today, but that process exists, and that's a check and balance on the Supreme Court, and it's our ability to keep the republic moving, I guess. What was I going to do? Someone asked about the Fed papers. I know 10 is probably the most important in terms of understanding why we have a large republic, the idea of factions, and how to control factions, right? Factions is the idea that people tend to group themselves together. Madison writes, Hamilton, that, people more than any other area of commonness is economics, that people tend to group and factionalize amongst property owners and non-property owners. He starts to sound a little Marxist, but basically he's saying there's only two things you can do about that. You can either eliminate the differences, and then I guess you're a commie, right? Or you can try to limit the blunt of those. And that's why we have a large republic. So we have many voices, and it's hard for any one group not to break down and other factions within their factions. But Fed 10 is really important. Is it 47, Paul, checks?
Honestly, I tell my students not to worry about anything.
Yeah, no, I don't either. I 10 is the one that I go, if you pick one, 10 is really cool to have under your belt, but not as important as all this other stuff. I'm going to touch third parties just with my finger really quick, because it's not a huge on the test, but third parties in my mind operate almost as elevators in de-alignment and realignment. Third parties, they could exist, right? Constitutionally, they could do great if they had to, if they could do it. But they never have, and there's probably a lot of reasons for that. But in terms of how I would see it, or I analyze it, is in a sense they bring ideas to the table, right? So it might be Ross Perot talking about reform in the budget and a balanced budget, whatever amendment, and then the other party's going, wow, a lot of people like that idea, and taking that onto their platform. So maybe the Democratic Party hears Bernie Sanders, maybe they don't. Maybe they're going to start to adopt some of those policies to get Bernie people to vote for the Democrats this time. So third parties like the Dixiecrats or the Populists or the Reform Party, Free Soil even, they operate as engines to shift people from one party sometimes to another party. So I'm a white Southerner. I'm a Democrat. I love the 10th Amendment. I love my government. What's going on with civil rights? I don't like this a lot. I'll vote for the Dixiecrats. Wow, Nixon's talking to me now. I'm a Republican. So that's kind of how I see how they operate. It's not a rule. It's not what they have to operate that way. But I think as we look at American history, in many cases, they do operate as kind of vehicles sometimes to get people to a party, with ideas that might be third rail ideas, ideas that aren't being talked about, that are now at the table of political dinner. I'm tired. It's 9:48. What do you think, Paul? We're going to go just 10 more minutes.
Okay. Well, I think you're right about that, but I also think that it's important to understand that the real reason that they don't get a lot of traction in the electoral system. Yeah, because we have what are called single member electoral districts. In other words, in any electoral district, whether it's a congressional district or whether it's like a senatorial district, which is like the state, within that area, in any competitive election, there can only be one winner. And the winner doesn't need a majority. The winner needs a plurality. They simply need more votes than anybody else. And so a third party actually would have to win straight up elections where they get votes that outnumber Republicans and Democrats both. And while they can pull that off in local elections here and there, and while they can pull it off maybe in some congressional elections, very rarely, national stage it's not feasible, right? People are too tied to the idea of Democrat or Republican. They don't want to throw their vote away on the Green Party or the Libertarians.
Everything becomes a binary choice. Everything at the end of the day, people go, well, if you vote for the third party, you're wasting your vote. So you got to vote for the Democrats or the Republicans. And remember, in Europe, it's proportional a lot. They have a lot of parties, like 20 or 30 parties, and then they have to end up forming coalitions. And I just want to say this out loud. You have to remember that even if you're a progressive, pinko, liberal, the idea of the government was always to make change difficult. That, go back, start in the beginning with the Articles of Confederation, this fear of government, right? The whole idea of, John Locke and natural rights and consent of the governed. So the Constitution, no checks and balances, but know why checks and balances, know why we have the 10th Amendment, know why powers are separated, know why it's such a pain in the ass to pass a law, because it's supposed to take a long time, because it's supposed to be a deliberate process. If we're going to allow the government, which the people formed, to pass laws, to regulate society, to do things. Because remember, the founders, people wrote the Constitution, maybe not all of them, but a lot of them feared government. So I think that's why that's in there. And maybe Paul can keep talking.
Well, and I agree with you. And like there are one or two ways to approach it. And depending on the political climate at any given time, parties can approach this differently. In one way, if there's not too much what we call political polarization, differences between the two parties where ideologically they're moving away from one another. But if there isn't much and they're actually very centrist for a time, then they can come together to make actual change. And the checks and balances allow that process to be deliberative and keep it all nice and packaged up and get them to get through things. But on the other hand, checks and balances, when there's a polarized climate, can cause one party that gets a majority to try and slam through all of the stuff that they want to get done, that they promised voters out on the campaign trail. They want to slam through all those things so that they can say that they did them, and then throw it sort of out there and hope that in the next election they don't lose both houses of Congress or they don't lose the presidency, and then maybe have the other party show up and all of a sudden start jamming through all the stuff that they want, that uses checks and balances to their advantage. And there is some pressure, when the 2016 election was over, Republicans were very excited about the possibility of having both houses of Congress and the president of the United States, because then theoretically you could just start shoving all of the Republican agenda through. And it turned out that the Republican Party, even though it represents, people who should theoretically be relatively like-minded, encompasses such a broad range of ideologies that they can't come up with great, very specific legislation without upsetting the members that are on the fringe, either too conservative or too liberal for any idea.
It's probably the ones that are too liberal now, like the ring around the suburbs, around cities like Philly and whatever it might be. They might not be too keen on repealing Obamacare or being really hardcore on immigration or having an aggressive whatever foreign policy. So Paul's right. It's hard for the Republican Party. It would be hard for the Democrats too, because Democrats, they get banking money. Democrats, many times have to get votes from, districts that might not be in the inner city that you would normally associate them with. So it goes to back to that faction idea that, the Democrats and Republicans represent a large faction ideologically, but within that large faction, there's a lot of different factions. And That's what's supposed to keep us all together. Now, we're going to wrap this up soon. And Paul's done this, he's doing this now. I've been out of the class for 5 or 6 years. Everyone's asking, what are the free responses? I don't think there's an easy way to answer that. But I'm going to let Paul tell you at least which ones he thinks, if you're going to stay up for another hour, maybe you should focus on. But again, I'm going to tell you this out loud. Get some sleep, guys. Don't be up all night. And a lot of you are asking questions we've already answered. So whether it's about 527s or soft money or campaign fire, you can watch the video. It's going to upload as soon as we're done in a minute. Or go to Paul's YouTube or my YouTube or Tom, and there is a video waiting for you to watch, because we can't go over everything for sure. So if you had to, if I put you in the corner, Sergeant, I said, wow, $1 million, what do you think they're going to be? What are the ones do you think are probably the best for kids to be prepared for?
Okay, one is going to mention a branch of government. If it's $1 million, that's about as specific as I'm going to get, because I'll be right. Okay.
Right. So, yeah, executive, legislative, or Supreme Court. How about that? We're helping you right now.
No, look, I'm trying to predict FRQs, because you just can't do it. But I will tell you this: the College Board comes out and says that 40% of the exam, roughly 40 to 45% of the exam, is on the branches of government. So you can probably bet that 2 of the FRQs are going to be very heavily testing your knowledge of the executive, the legislative, or the judicial branch, or all 3. Throw the bureaucracy in there. And they're going to be really asking about powers, like what they can do, maybe how they check one another. Like, I would definitely look at that. As for the others, like, really, they could be almost anything. They could be about media. They could be about political parties. They could be about the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. They could be about civil rights and civil liberties. I mean, we just don't.
We didn't cover that really well tonight. So if you have 5 minutes or 10 minutes, I think we probably all have a linkage video, a linkage institution video, so you understand how not just media, but political parties are linkage institutions as well. Any institution or organization that brings information to the public to try to sway them or get them to do something is a linkage institution. And that's critical. And I think it's critical today because there's a lot going on in terms of media and government and fake news and all of that stuff. But linkage institutions, Paul's right. That's not a bad idea.
Yeah. So I would just, look at.
Yeah, I know.
You guys.
Selective Incorporation, not a bad idea. Campaign finance, not a bad idea. Bureaucracy, not a bad idea. You could go right down the line. I think that at this point, you're probably as prepared as you're going to be. Maybe 1 or 2 videos, guys, and then just think about passing and go to bed. Because I'm telling you, kids are stupid. Adults are stupid too. But I was a stupid kid. I'd cram through college, 4 or 5 in the morning. Sergeant, what was I doing? That's nuts.
And it is, because what you don't want to do is spend all this time, all this effort, stay up all night, and then literally fall asleep while you're writing the FRQs. I mean, what good does that do you? So get some sleep and sit there and look. If you run into something that you don't recognize, you don't know, these guys who are political scientists and lawmakers, they're not all that creative when they name things. So if you look at the way things are named, you can kind of see where what it might be. Just sort of reason it out. If you're asked to
stare decisis, that was the one I always got. Stare decisis, literally stare at the stupid decision. Yeah, right? The Supreme Court stare at precedent and former decisions influence their decisions. But Paul's right. You could figure it out in many cases.
Yeah. If you see 2 things and it asks how they're related, think, well, I know what this one does and I know what this one does. I don't know how they interact, but what makes sense? How would they logically interact? And if you do that, you're gonna be okay.
So you're gonna be okay anyway, guys, because believe it or not, I know you want to pass, but it's just a test, man. You're gonna be okay either way. And we certainly wish you the best and we hope you pass. Thank your teacher, because it's your classroom teacher that's there every day teaching you. And they deserve many, many props, because it's a hard course to teach and it's a hard course to take. But you guys definitely you have a good chance. I believe in all of you. So, Paul, any final words? We're going to cut off in a minute here.
No, I mean, the kumbaya moment was had right there. So I'm good. You guys are going to rock this test. So just go out there and make sure you write legibly.
Yeah. Nobody, like, you don't understand how many papers they have to grade, and they're probably cranky and all that. And then they got to read your nonsensical chicken scratch. Someone's going to give you a 0. Yeah. I'm going to say take your time on the test, but don't take your time. Remember Paul's advice. Write about what you know first, and then get points. All right. Get points, because each free response is a multitude of points. And do the best you can, guys. You're going to be great. Where attention goes, energy flows. Take care of each other. You're all good people. And whether you're a pastor or not, we love you anyway. All right, guys. We'll see you later. Make sure you subscribe to Paul, subscribe to Tom, subscribe to me, and you get 3 extra points on the exam. How about that? Sweet. Good night, folks. Farewell.